The sound came before the number did, that's the part one still think about, a kind of even hum the brake fins make when they're gripping correctly, and that morning the hum was there but it was thinner, lower, it didn't build the way it should have. I was standing at the control panel with a cup of coffee going cold on the console, 6:40 in the morning, first test cycle of the season, and I looked up through the shed window just in time to watch the train's nose creep past the marked stop line. 11 feet, that's what it came out to when we measured it afterward, 11 feet past where an empty test train was supposed to stop, drifting slow and quiet toward the loading platform gate, and there's a strange half-second in a moment like that where your body already knows something's wrong before your brain catches up to the number, your stomach drops a beat ahead of your thinking. My lead technician, Ronnie, was standing next to me, and he said it before the dashboard even caught up, that shouldn't have happened, quiet, almost to himself, and he was already reaching for the radio before I'd finished processing what I'd just watched, and I remember that stuck with me afterward, because Ronnie's not a superstitious guy, he trusts instruments over instinct, always has. So when even he says his gut caught it before the screen did, that tells you something about how far behind the system actually was. I've been Chief Ride Safety Engineer at Meridian Attractions for 11 years, and in all that time I don't think I've ever pulled a ride the way I pulled the Palisade that morning, called it in as a Level 2 incident even though nobody was hurt, because nobody had been on it yet. That's the entire reason we run 3 empty laps before the gates open. The park had been closed since January for the off-season maintenance window, so this was the Palisade's first real run in 10 weeks, and the weather that week had turned strange. An overnight system dropped temperatures into the low 20s, colder than we ever build for in that part of the state. Most seasons we never see anything close to it. I hadn't been worried, and that's the part that still gets me, because we had a system called Vantage, a predictive maintenance dashboard that had been running for almost 3 years by then, and every morning before test cycles it spit out a readiness score for every train on every ride, green, yellow, red. The Palisade showed green that morning, 94% confidence, nothing flagged. We ran the empty laps anyway, that's protocol regardless of what the dashboard says. First lap clean, second lap clean, third lap the train came down the final descent into the brake run and the magnetic fins engaged about 40% slower than they should have. I stood there afterward with the printed incident report in my hand, staring at the readout that had said 94% confidence, and the number didn't match what my own hands had felt through the control panel a few minutes earlier. The brake response was wrong, and the system had told me it wasn't. We modeled it 3 separate ways in the days that followed, with 3 different engineers running the numbers independently, because none of us wanted to be the one who got the math wrong on something this serious, and all 3 came back close together. At full capacity and full speed that same brake response deficit would have put the train somewhere between 4 and 9 feet short of a hard stop at the loading gate, and there's a loaded platform on the other side of that gate during actual operating hours, not an empty one. That's the number that kept me from sleeping properly for 2 weeks, more than any conversation I had after, more than anything anyone said to me, just that number sitting there. I pulled the brake fin temperature logs first. That's the obvious place to start. Magnetic brake fins lose some effectiveness in extreme cold. Everybody in this industry knows that. It's basic physics, cold metal, tighter tolerances, slightly different magnetic behavior. So the question wasn't whether cold affects braking, the question was why Vantage didn't already know that. I pulled the model documentation next, which took longer than it should have, because nobody on my team had actually read it end to end in 2 years. We trusted the vendor, we trusted the rollout team, we trusted the dashboard. Buried in the specification was the variable waiting for ambient temperature, and it was low, deliberately low, because the training data the model had been built on came almost entirely from our warm climate parks. 4 of our 6 properties never see freezing temperatures at all. The model had barely seen cold weather, and the little bit it had seen came from routine seasonal cooling, gradual, not a sharp overnight drop like we'd just gotten. The confidence interval had looked rock solid on paper, tight, statistically clean, because it was built on a distribution that never included the exact scenario we handed it that morning. The confidence score wasn't measuring how well the current conditions matched the training data, I realized. It was measuring internal consistency of the sensor readings against each other, so as long as the sensors were reporting numbers that looked mathematically normal to each other, the system called it green, even though the underlying conditions were something it had almost never seen. My sister-in-law, Priya, is married to my brother, and she's also the one who brought Vantage into Meridian in the first place. She was vice president of data systems at the time, still is. She'd spent 3 years fighting a reluctant board to get the project funded, and she believed in it completely, and honestly, so had I. We'd worked together for close to a decade by then. Family dinners turned into shop talk more often than either of our spouses appreciated. There was a stretch a few years back, before Vantage was even approved, where she used to sit in on our mechanical inspection walkdowns just to understand what data we were generating by hand. She'd stand next to Ronnie with a clipboard asking why we measured brake fin gap the way we did, why calipers instead of a laser sensor, and she genuinely wanted to understand the physical reasoning before she tried to model it. I still remember one Thanksgiving, maybe 5 years back, when she cornered me by the kitchen island with a notebook, asking me to sketch out exactly how the fin brake system decelerated a train through the whole run, slope by slope, and my brother came in halfway through and just laughed and said, "You two do this every single holiday," and he wasn't wrong, but I never minded it. I liked that she wanted the mechanical truth of it before she ever tried to put a number on it. That's part of why I trusted the eventual system so much. I'd watched her earn the mechanical literacy herself. This wasn't someone parachuting in with a spreadsheet who'd never touched a brake fin, and it's part of why what happened next was so hard. I called her that same afternoon, went straight to her instead of taking it through the formal engineering review board first, which in hindsight probably wasn't fair to her. I should have brought the data to the review board before I brought it to family. "We validated this extensively before rollout," she said, and I remember answering, "Validated on what data, Priya?" and there was a long pause on the line. I think that was the moment she already knew, before either of us said it out loud, but that day she wanted engineering logs instead, sensor calibration records, anything that could point to a hardware fault instead of a model fault, and I gave her everything, because I wanted to be wrong too. Honestly, I wanted this to be a bad sensor and not a 3-year blind spot in a system with her name on it. The blind spot wasn't in her understanding of brakes, that part one want to be clear about. It was in a data pipeline 3 layers removed from her, built by a vendor integration team, pulling from a database that predated her involvement. She'd inherited a boundary she didn't draw herself, and she was defending a system she'd put her name on without personally verifying every layer underneath it, which is a different kind of exposure than making a mistake yourself, and honestly a more common one than people like to admit. Corporate pushed back hard on keeping the ride closed, harder than I expected. The regional VP flew in 4 days after the incident, a man named Andre Fabian, and his first question wasn't about safety, it was about spring break attendance projections. The Palisades our signature coaster, it's on half our marketing material for that time of year, and every day it stayed closed was a real number on somebody's spreadsheet. We met in a glass-walled conference room on the 3rd floor, Andre in a suit that looked wrong for a maintenance shed conversation, Priya on one side of the table, me on the other, and he spread a printout of projected attendance losses in front of us like it settled the matter on its own. He asked whether we could reopen with increased monitoring instead of a full closure, tighter thresholds, something that let the ride operate while we investigated in the background, and I told him no, flatly, because the failure mode we'd found wasn't a slow leak we could watch creep toward a threshold, it was closer to binary, cold enough or not cold enough, and we still didn't know exactly where that line sat. He asked if Priya's team could give him a revised confidence number within 48 hours that he could take back to the board, and I told him, "You can have a number in 48 hours, I can't promise you it'll be a number you should trust," which wasn't the answer he wanted, but Priya backed me on that call, completely, no hesitation, and I think that mattered more coming from her than it would have coming from just me, because she was the one who'd built the system he was asking about. Andre didn't like it. He said something about how the board wasn't going to be satisfied with, "I don't know yet," for very long, and Priya looked at him and said, "Then the board can be unsatisfied, because I'm not putting a number in front of them I can't stand behind," and he left without another word, and I remember thinking, sitting there, that whatever tension existed between the two of us that week, this wasn't it. Whatever else was hard between us that stretch, she never once tried to protect the system's reputation over the ride's safety, not for a single day of it. 26 days, that's how long the Palisades stayed closed. We lost most of spring break, marketing had to pull ad spend, corporate took a real hit, and that number followed Priya into board meetings for months afterward, people bringing it up sideways, not directly blaming her, but making sure everyone remembered whose system had caused it. Those 26 days meant full manual walkdowns every single operating morning on every other coaster in the park too, not just the Palisade, because once we knew Vantage had a blind spot on one ride, we couldn't trust it blind on any of them until we understood how deep the problem ran. Ronnie and two other technicians, a younger guy named Petey and a woman named Odalise who transferred over from the water park earlier that year, spent their mornings out on cold platforms with clipboards and calipers, checking brake fin gaps by hand on 11 different rides before a single guest walked through the gates. I went out with them most mornings, partly to help, partly because I didn't trust myself to sit still in the office while it was happening, and there was something almost meditative about it, the quiet of the park before opening, breath fogging in the cold, the small satisfying click of a caliper closing on a fin, numbers written by hand in a notebook instead of populated automatically on a screen. It felt slower and it felt right, and more than once I caught myself thinking we'd give some of this up too easily 3 years earlier without ever really deciding to. Petey asked me once, out on the Palisades brake run at maybe 6 in the morning, cold enough that his breath hung in the air between us, whether we were ever going to trust Vantage again the way we used to, and I told him honestly that I didn't think we should, not in the same way, not blind confidence in a single number, and he seemed to take that fine, better than I expected, like it matched something he'd already been thinking on his own. Some of that was fair, maybe. None of us build anything perfect the first time. That's not really the question is what you do once you find the gap, and she didn't hide from it. The break came about 10 days into the investigation, and it started with something Ronnie mentioned offhand one afternoon, that his old supervisor used to talk about, the winter the coasters wouldn't stop right, some story from decades back that had turned into a kind of park legend nobody took literally anymore, the sort of thing you hear at a holiday party and half believe. I almost let it go. It sounded exactly like the kind of exaggerated old-timer story you learn to filter out in this job, but it cost nothing to ask facilities if there were records that old still around, and the woman who runs our archive room, Consuela, didn't even have to look anything up. She just said, "Third cabinet on the left, might take me a minute to find the right box," like she'd been waiting 15 years for someone to ask. The archive room itself was 2 floors below the main offices, fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, rows of gray metal cabinets that hadn't been touched in what looked like a decade, dust thick enough to see in the light from the door, and Consuela moved through it like she had a map of the place memorized in her head even though I doubt anyone had asked her for anything this old in years. Meridian's predecessor company, before the parks were bought out in the 90s, had kept paper maintenance logs going back to 1971, mostly handwritten, sitting in 3 file cabinets in a records room nobody had opened in years, and in those boxes were 2 prior cold weather incidents, 1984 and 1996, both on different coasters, both magnetic brake systems, both showing the same pattern, reduced fin engagement during unseasonable cold snaps, both handled at the time with manual cold weather protocols that got written into the maintenance manual and then, somewhere along the way, quietly dropped when the parks modernized and everything went digital. I sat on an overturned crate in that archive room for almost an hour, reading through both reports twice, the handwriting slanted and careful, a different engineer's name signed at the bottom of each one, men who probably retired decades before I ever started at the park, and it struck me that they'd solved this exact problem once already, quietly, with nothing but calipers and a cold weather checklist, and then the solution had simply been allowed to disappear. The knowledge had existed, it just never made it anywhere near the model. It had been sitting in a file cabinet, undigitized, because nobody doing the original data migration for Vantage thought to ask facilities for 40-year-old paper records they'd pulled from the operational database, which only went back to 2003. I met Priya at her office, just the two of us, and I laid the 84 and 96 reports on her desk and didn't say much. I let her read them. For a long time she said nothing, just kept flipping back and forth between the 2 reports, and then she said, "I built a model on data I never questioned the completeness of," and I said something like, "None of us questioned it, that's kind of the point," and she looked up at me and said, "Don't do that, don't make this softer than it is." I was the one telling the board this system understood risk better than a person with 40 years of institutional memory, and it turns out the institutional memory was sitting 8 feet from my office the whole time. There was a stretch of about a month after that where things were tense at family gatherings. My brother mentioned once that Priya had been quieter than usual, working late, and I felt responsible for some of that. Even though I don't think I handled the actual engineering wrong, I think I could have handled the delivery with more care. We had a family dinner about 3 weeks into it, one of those standing monthly things neither of us had the energy to cancel, and it was strained the entire meal, small talk about nothing, until my brother asked, straight out, whether the ride was fixed yet, and Priya set her fork down and said, "It's complicated," in a tone that ended the conversation before it started, and I remember catching her eye across the table and neither of us said anything else about it for the rest of the night. We just talked about our parents' upcoming trip instead, like the last 3 weeks hadn't happened. She called me eventually, not about the ride, about us. She said, "I need you to be the engineer with me on this, not the brother-in-law trying to soften it," and I told her I'd try, and mostly I think I managed it, though I'm not going to pretend every conversation after that was easy. I want to be honest about something else too, because it gets left out when people hear this story secondhand. It gets told like I'm the one who caught the flaw and she's the one who made it, but I signed off on the rollout too. I sat through the same validation review she did, and I told corporate myself, more than once, that the manual walk-down process was outdated, slower, prone to human error. I'd helped build the case for trusting the system over the old paper and calipers way of doing things, so when it failed, some of that responsibility was mine too, and calling her first that first afternoon was partly me trying to sort that out before I had to explain it to anyone else. 3 things changed once we had the full picture. First, we dug up the historical paper records for every ride in the park, not just the Palisade, digitized everything we could find going back to the 70s, and fed the confirmed cold weather incidents into a supplemental dataset specifically weighted for edge case validation, kept separate from the main training pipeline so it wouldn't get diluted by 3 years of routine warm weather data. Second, we added a distribution check, not just a confidence score based on internal sensor consistency, but a flag that compares current operating conditions against the range of conditions the model was actually trained on, so if ambient temperature, or humidity, or wind, falls outside what Vantage has meaningfully seen before, it doesn't quietly extrapolate and call itself confident. It throws an explicit out-of-distribution warning and defaults to requiring a manual walk-down. The third one was Priya's idea, and it's the one I think matters most long-term. She pushed corporate to fund an annual archive review, someone whose actual job, every year, is to go through facilities records, old logs, retired engineers' notes, anything sitting in a drawer somewhere, and check whether any of it should be feeding into the models we depend on, because the failure here wasn't really a math problem. It was an organizational one. We let 40 years of hard-earned knowledge sit in a filing cabinet while we built a system that assumed the digital record was the whole record. That project didn't get approved easily. It took her another 6 months of arguing with the same board she'd spent 3 years convincing to fund Vantage in the first place, and she didn't quietly patch the temperature variable and call it fixed. She used the mistake to argue for something bigger and slower and less flashy, which is a much harder sell in a boardroom. She stood in front of that board twice, once to explain what went wrong, and again 6 months later to ask for more money to fix the underlying problem instead of just the symptom. Ronnie still works at the park, and he actually helps run the archive review program now, part-time. It fits him. He's the kind of guy who reads old maintenance logs for fun, and there's something fitting about that. The person who's got caught the problem before the dashboard did is now the person making sure the next gap doesn't sit undiscovered for 40 years. We went back afterward and did a quiet inventory of every automated system across all 6 properties, ride readiness, queue flow prediction, even the water chemistry monitoring at the aquatic parks, and asked the same question of each one: what's the actual range of conditions this thing has been tested against, versus the range of conditions it's being trusted to operate in? And we found smaller versions of the same gap in at least 2 other places, nothing as serious, but the pattern was there, systems that looked confident because they'd never been shown how much they didn't know. One of those was a Q-flow model at our largest property, built almost entirely on 5 years of summer and holiday weekend crowd data, which meant it had never seen how the park behaved during a slow, cold, off-season weekday, and its recommendations for staffing levels on days like that turned out to be based on almost nothing. Extrapolated confidently from conditions that had nothing in common with what was actually happening on the ground. Nobody had been hurt by it, but it easily could have gone the other way, understaffing a ride during an unexpected surge instead of overstaffing one during a lull. Priya led that inventory herself, she asked to, and I think that mattered to her, being the one who went looking instead of waiting to be told to look. It wasn't loud or dramatic, there wasn't a company-wide memo with her name on an apology, it was quieter than that, just her showing up to 11 separate meetings over 2 months, asking the same uncomfortable question over and over until it became normal to ask it. Where that leaves the two of us now is still working together, still family, but I won't pretend it's exactly what it was before. There's a version of this where we hug it out at a company picnic and everything's fine, and that's not quite what happened. What happened is we're more careful with each other now, more precise, we double-check things we used to just take on faith, and I think that's probably healthier even if it's less comfortable. I think about that first phone call more than almost anything else from that stretch, calling her before the review board. Part of why I did that wasn't protectiveness toward her, or not only that, part of it was that I'd sat in budget meetings for 3 years nodding along while she pitched Vantage, and when it failed, calling her first was partly me trying to sort out my own responsibility before I had to explain it to anyone else. I don't think I would have gone looking for the gap if that morning had never happened. That's the uncomfortable answer. We don't audit the things that are working, we audit the things that break, and I got lucky this one broke on an empty test train at low speed instead of somewhere worse. I think about that a lot when I walk the park on an ordinary day now, past rides that have never once given us a wrong number, and I have to remind myself that never given us a wrong number, and never going to, are not the same claim, they just sound the same when you say them quickly enough. What I tell newer engineers now is that a green light is a claim, not a fact. The system is telling you it's confident, and confidence and correctness are not the same thing, especially anywhere the model hasn't actually been tested by reality yet. I tell them to ask what the system has never seen, not just what it's seen, because the gap is usually hiding in the first question, not the second. I'd still run the empty test laps if I had to do that morning over again. That part of the process worked exactly the way it was supposed to. That's not where the failure happened. The failure happened 3 years earlier, in a data migration meeting I wasn't even in the room for, when somebody decided the digital record from 2003 forward was good enough. And nobody thought to walk down the hall and ask facilities what else they had. The Palisade reopened on a Thursday morning, no ceremony, no press release, just the same 3 empty test laps we always run, except this time Ronnie and 2 other technicians did a full manual walk down first, calipers on every brake fin, cold weather checklist clipped to a board that hadn't existed 3 weeks earlier, and Priya was there too, standing at the back of the shed, arms crossed, watching the readout the whole way through without saying a word. The first lap came down clean, the hum built the way it was supposed to and cut off sharp at the marked line, and I heard Ronnie exhale next to me like he'd been holding his breath since March. Priya didn't say anything either, she just nodded once, to herself more than to anyone else, and went back upstairs. The Palisade's running fine now, it opens most mornings the same way it always did, 3 empty laps before the gates, and most days the hum builds the way it's supposed to and cuts off clean, and most days I don't think about any of this at all. But every so often, on a cold morning, I still find myself standing at that control panel a few seconds longer than I need to, listening.